Hello, my name is Julia Mahoney, and this summer I'm a teaching assistant for Hudson Institute Political Studies program. I recently graduated from Davidson College in 2023, where I studied history and political science. Today, I'm a Ph.D. student at Boston College studying political philosophy. And today I have here with me Professor Robert C. Bartlett. Professor Bartlett is the first Baroquist professor of Hellenic political studies at Boston College. His principal area of research is classical political philosophy, with particular attention to the thinkers of ancient Hellas, including Thucydides, Plato, Aristotle, and Xenophon. In addition to teaching at Boston College and in the political studies program, Professor Bartlett has been published widely in leading scholarly journals. He is a prolific author, translator, and editor, publishing editions of books including Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics and Art of Rhetoric, Plato's Protagoras and Meno, Xenophon's shorter Socratic writings, and most recently, Political Rhetoric and Theory and Practice, a Reader. With just a few easy clicks, you can buy any and all of these books off of Amazon.com. Before joining the Boston College faculty, Professor Bartlett served as the Arthur M. Blank National Endowment for the Humanities Distinguished Teaching Professor at Emory University. He is a graduate of the University of Toronto and holds a Master's in Classics and a Ph.D. in Political Science from Boston College. Please join me in welcoming Professor Bartlett.
Thank you, Julia, very much.
How are you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you.
How are you finding the political studies program?
Great, so far so good.
Yeah.
Challenging, exhausting. The students are very good, as they always are, and a pleasure to be with.
How long have you been teaching for the political studies program?
I think I've been teaching since it started. And I'm not sure how many years ago.
We won't say.
Blend together. Yeah. More than a decade, I think.
And which section do you teach?
Generally I teach the first week, which I'm doing this year, and that the theme of which is foundations. And so we begin with Machiavelli as a kind of founder of modernity, and then turn toward the end of the week to the classical city in Plato's Republic.
Wonderful. I have a couple questions regarding rhetoric, given your most recent book.
Sure.
Political philosophy is the combination of rhetoric and contemplation, towing the line between the vita activa and the vita contemplativa. To ask the age-old question, why should a philosopher be interested in rhetoric? Or why should a politician be interested in philosophy? How ought one to approach political philosophy?
There's a lot in that question,
I know.
so I'll pick and choose as I like a smorgasbord. I'll pick and choose. Maybe I'll start with the question of why a philosopher should be interested in rhetoric. And I can prove that they are or were because Aristotle, the philosopher as he was called in the medieval tradition, wrote a book called The Art of Rhetoric, and which remains an absolutely fundamental text in the study of rhetoric and has been since it was published. It's been adopted and adapted in many ways, expanded in some ways, in the medieval period especially, but really that's the core of it. And the question is, the question you pose is why. He studied politics, he studied biology, metaphysics, and so on. Why rhetoric? What does that have to do? And it's a long and difficult question, but I would say that the ancient thinkers, including Aristotle, were not Enlightenment thinkers in the way that we think of that term, that there could be a kind of universal change in human society and human culture such that we would live our lives by the bright light of the sun, the truth. And I think the ancient thinkers, including Aristotle, always thought that in a political community there would be reigning opinions, some of which would be better than others, truer than others, but they would have the character of opinions. And that means that science, philosophy, wouldn't be adequate for the guidance of political life. And insofar as political life would always be, at least to some extent, in the realm of opinion, what you need is this thing called rhetoric, which is the art of persuasive speech. How to persuade someone to do something or not to do something, not simply in the light of the truth, but on the basis of an argument which appears to that person, given their existing opinions or prejudices, as the case may be, that it would appear persuasive. And although Aristotle did a very great deal, perhaps more than any other single human being, to bring a kind of science to the world, philosophy to the world, nonetheless he thought that there would always be a place for rhetoric. But the big challenge that I think he tried to face, at least, is rhetoric needs to be responsible. Because if you're not dealing simply with truths, mathematical or otherwise, you're dealing in opinion, then for that very fact, people can be manipulated by their opinions, by persuasive speech. And so rhetoric, I think his view was, is a necessity. It will always be with us. For so long as there have been human beings, we've tried to persuade each other to do or not to do something. And no amount of science, philosophy will change that fundamental fact. And so he tried to bring a kind of precision and clarity to the practice of rhetoric, but also a kind of guidance, a moral, political guidance that would make it more responsible or at least less irresponsible.
Wonderful. And you lay this out very well in your book.
Thank you. Which is available widely.
Which is available on Amazon.com for purchasing.
In paperback.
In paperback.
Although the hardback's available too.
The hardback is, I hear it's better.
It's certainly more expensive.
Yeah. Kind of going off of this, how might we best work to revitalize the art of persuasion as students? Other than, of course, reading the compilations of history's greatest examples.
Yeah.
Other than reading books, what are some more active ways of having rhetoric be oriented toward the truth?
Right. Well, a couple of things. I do think it's important to study the theory of rhetoric, what it is. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean Aristotle, but of course, as I've said, he was and is extremely influential in the understanding of it. So I think students would have to become more self-aware that they are surrounded by rhetoric as a matter of fact. It doesn't present itself as such necessarily, but they're surrounded by attempts to persuade them of one thing or another. And so, to put it crudely, they need to become better consumers of rhetoric. And that means, for example, to become more aware of the devices of rhetoric and of the kinds of persuasion, modes of persuasion, as Aristotle calls them, that can be used, appeals to various passions, emotions, and so on. And so, for example, once one becomes more self-aware of rhetoric as an art, as a practice, you might find yourself in something like the following situation. You're listening to someone speak. It could be in any number of circumstances, political or not. And you find yourself drawn in by what the speaker says. Perhaps they begin with an anecdote that's funny or charming or moving. And you begin to feel yourself, as it were, lifted up by the rhetoric. And that's a moment where one could realize that that's happening to you. And you could raise the question, why? Why is this happening? And it could be for legitimate or illegitimate reasons. And so you become, in a way, as I say, a more self-aware audience to rhetoric. And therefore, insofar as you have a certain distance from it, you can be evaluated. What exactly is the speaker saying? How is he or she saying it? And above all, to what end? Am I being played? Or is this a moving speech in the service of a good cause? So that you become more aware of the effect of speech, rhetorical speech, on you. And of course, you could work it the other way. You could begin, in one way or another, to write speeches, or to think of speeches, arguments at least, and to begin to apply some of the things you could learn from Aristotle and others in your own daily life or in your professional life. I teach a course on rhetoric to undergraduates, and the final assignment, so we study all of rhetorical devices and so on, and we study a lot of Aristotle and a lot of actual political speeches, but the final assignment is to write one of a series of speeches for some particular end. In Massachusetts, for example, marijuana has been legalized, and so they imagine themselves being the chapter president on campus of STOP! Which stands for Students Totally Opposed to Pot. And they have to craft a speech to the incoming freshman class why they're opposed to marijuana. Now, they may not be in real life, but that's irrelevant to the assignment. They have to have a certain goal in mind, a persuasive end to discourage the use of marijuana, for example. And then using what they've learned over the course of the semester, they have to try to craft a speech which would reach that end. But they also have to analyze their own speech. Why did they make this move at this time, and so on. So it's a practice of the use of rhetoric, but also a kind of self-conscious application of principles of rhetoric.
And in your teaching and in your writing, have you noticed one of the three different kinds of rhetoric? Well, I guess there are three different kinds. There's the,
Yeah.
Yeah. Have you seen one of them become much more prevalent or one of them much more degraded when you're reading the ancients compared to contemporaries, or when you're engaging with students? Do you think that they're much less able to recognize one particular type of rhetoric?
I wouldn't say that so much. I mean, there's judicial rhetoric,
Yeah.
which the home of which is, of course, a courtroom. There are a few famous examples in modern times. Johnny Cochran's summing up speech in the O.J. trial, for example. But probably more common in the lives of students, at any rate, would be epideictic or rhetoric of praise or blame. The funeral oration would be a classic example of that. And then deliberative rhetoric, which is probably the most massive. Any political speech. You're deliberating whether to do something or not to do something. I'd say that all three are in a pretty sorry state at the moment. But the most important, perhaps, for our lives in a broader sense might be deliberative rhetoric, political rhetoric. And since we're coming into a presidential election season, or we're in one, we'll see the state of it.
Yes.
And in fact, there'll be a couple of debates, so we could judge from that perhaps the state of
Yes.
deliberative rhetoric. I don't know how deliberative it will be.
Yes. Yes. I want to kind of veer back toward the program a little bit.
Sure.
During our first week of the program, the week that you normally teach, we read Machiavelli's The Prince. I guess this kind of does tie into the state of rhetoric today, but how do you best navigate Machiavelli's rhetoric, and what advice would you have for students reading works like these for the first time?
Yeah, that's a long and difficult question too, Machiavelli's rhetoric. My general advice in reading any of these classic texts is to pay very close attention to the surface of the text. That's how you have to begin. What is it they actually say in the terms in which they actually say it? And listen to them and what they say, what's important and what's not important. So just to give a simple example, at one point in the Prince, Machiavelli gives a list of the virtues and vices. There are 11. It's meant to be an exhaustive list. Justice is not on the list. It's a striking thing. And one of the students this week started speaking about justice, Machiavelli on justice, and so on and so on. And I just pointed out the fact that he omits it. Now, why he omits it, that's an open question. But the fact that he omits it is indeed a fact in the list of his virtues. And that sort of the conversation went from there. The most obvious thing to say about Machiavelli's rhetoric is that he's shocking. He says repeatedly, we have to eliminate the bloodline of a prince, which means kill the whole family.
It is better not to take someone's property than it is to kill their own father.
Right.
Yeah.
They forget the loss of the father sooner than the loss of the patrimony, an extremely nasty remark for which the book is famous or infamous. So in a way, it's a strange rhetorical strategy and a complicated one. He shocks us. But the possibility is that he's even more shocking than we first realize. And that the initial shock is only that, and that there may be, there surely are deeper truths and perhaps even more disturbing truths beneath the surface, but the surface itself is shocking. And why he made that decision is a long question. I have noticed in my teaching of the book that surface repels some students, understandably, but it also thrills and attracts certain others. And perhaps he wanted to attract a certain kind of reader. He says at one point that the young are impetuous. And I suspect he wanted to attract young people who are young, at least in mind and spirit, who'd be open to new things. And so there is a kind of shocking come on in Machiavelli, but also a sustained and serious meditation on political life. And he invites you in this way by presenting himself as nobody's fool. Realism, it's sometimes attributed to him, a kind of uber-realism. And again, that can be shocking, but to some extent, if not attractive, then intriguing. Mm-hmm. And he draws you in that way.
Through rhetoric, rightly used, we can orient ourselves and those around us to the truth, or at least the pursuit of it, as we've been discussing. You write of rhetoric in your introduction of your latest book. We too endorse the study of rhetoric in our time, not because it cannot be misused, but precisely because it can be. Caveat auditor. The book concludes with a section on tyrannies and tyrants, showing us the dangers of rhetoric. How might we, as students, best bridge the gap between one's speech and one's reason? Or to put it another way, and perhaps a more philosophically confusing way, how might we prioritize the good over its beautifully appearing counterpart?
Yeah. That, too, is a difficult question. And to some extent, it goes back to something I said toward the beginning of our conversation, that one has to become a more informed, educated, and self-aware consumer of rhetoric. We're surrounded by it of necessity. That will never change. And so insofar as you become more aware of the devices of rhetoric, of the tools of rhetoric, you can not only use them better, but they will, to some extent, have less effect on you because you see them as a tool. And so you take a certain critical distance from the practice of rhetoric, and I think in general that's a very good thing. It doesn't mean, of course, that you reject arguments, even insofar as you find them rhetorical, i.e. that they have a kind of rhetorical surface. No, then the next step would be to try to think of them as arguments, as rational, or as the case may be, irrational arguments. So I do think it's important to undertake at some point the study of rhetoric as a practice, as an art, as Aristotle would call it. And so to teach yourself perhaps how to use it, but certainly how to become a warier listener.
I think a lot of students become very frustrated when they're talking about books, like over the course of the next 6 weeks, because when they think of rhetoric, they usually think of rhetoric wrongly used, wrongly oriented to the truth, and the thought of consciously using rhetoric to persuade when you think that you're telling the full truth seems to be irrelevant or not necessary, and when other people are consciously using rhetoric, it seems to be maliciously used.
And perhaps it often is, but I could give this example from Plato's Gorgias, Gorgias being the most famous teacher of rhetoric in antiquity, at least prior to Aristotle. He gives this example. His brother is a doctor, and the doctor says to the patient, you need to undergo this painful, risky, but absolutely necessary surgery. And the doctor, qua doctor, can't convince the patient to do it. And Gorgias says, I spent 10 minutes with the patient, and the patient agreed to the surgery. Now, Gorgias doesn't know anything about medicine. He trusts the judgment of his brother, who does. So there you have an example of the union of medicine, in this case, and rhetoric working together toward a good end. That the statement of medical facts weren't sufficient. They were too frightening, perhaps. Too hard to understand, maybe. Whereas the rhetorician took those same facts and presented them in such a way, and perhaps other thoughts too, in addition to those medical facts, and presented them in such a way that the patient said, okay, to the benefit of the patient. Mm-hmm. And there might be a political analog to the medical case too.
I want to conclude with more of a surface level question, perhaps. Okay. You briefly mention in your introduction of the book the age of sound bites and tweets and limited characters. In this spirit, do you have a favorite quote from one of these works of rhetoric, or perhaps more broadly, if you don't have a quote, a favorite speech that you continuously go back to?
I don't have a favorite quote, and I'm not even sure that I have a favorite speech. That might change from time to time, but I will say that I have a favorite book which is a source of extraordinarily rich political speech, and that's Thucydides' War of the Peloponnesians and Athenians. It's the single greatest collection that I know of such speeches, which were delivered in moments of grave political crisis, some of them by scoundrels, some of them by statesmen of the highest caliber and order, Themistocles, Pericles, others, trying to save their city from ruin, either from within or from without. And that's the single best collection of political rhetoric that I know of.
Well, thank you so much for spending time with us. And if you would like to hear more from Professor Bartlett, please apply to the Hudson Institute Political Studies program or simply go to Boston College.
Yes.